Margaret smoothed her crisp white apron as she stood in the grand foyer of the Riverside estate, her sensible shoes barely making a sound on the marble floor. At 52, she'd cleaned enough homes to know that wealth didn't always mean warmth, but she needed this job. Her references were good, her hands were steady, and she'd promised herself she wouldn't get too attached this time. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, led her through rooms that smelled of lemon polish and old money. "Mr. Harrison is very particular," she explained quietly. "He's a busy man, runs a technology firm downtown. You'll mostly see him in the evenings, if at all." Margaret nodded, taking in the elegant furniture, the oil paintings in gilded frames. Then she heard it, a tentative melody, just a few notes, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. "That's Emma," Mrs. Chen said, her voice softening. "Mr. Harrison's daughter. She's 7. Lost her sight in an accident 2 years ago. Same one that took her mother." She paused at a doorway. "She's struggling. Doesn't talk much anymore. The piano is the only thing that seems to reach her." Through the doorway, Margaret could see her, a small figure in a red velvet dress with a white collar, sitting at a grand piano that dwarfed her. A blindfold covered her eyes, and her tiny fingers pressed the keys with careful hesitation, as if afraid to wake something sleeping. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, the way it had when her own daughter was small, before time and distance had pulled them apart. The days passed slowly at first. Margaret dusted the crown molding, polished the silver, kept her head down. But every afternoon she'd hear those halting notes from the music room, and she'd pause, cloth in hand, listening. Emma would play the same phrase over and over, never quite finishing, never quite confident. On the 4th day, Margaret found herself standing in the doorway, watching. Emma sat very still, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. "Hello," Margaret said gently. "My name is Margaret. I work here now." Emma's hand stilled on the keys. She didn't turn around. "I used to play piano," Margaret continued, stepping into the room. "A long time ago. My grandmother taught me. She said music was like breathing. You don't think about it. You just let it flow." Still no response, but Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly. Margaret came closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "That piece you're playing, it's beautiful. Mozart, isn't it? The Easy Sonata?" A small nod. "May I?" Margaret gestured toward the bench, then remembered the girl couldn't see her. "May I sit with you?" Another pause. Then Emma shifted over, making room. Margaret sat down, the bench creaking slightly under their combined weight. Up close, she could see the girl's chin, set with determination, the way her fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the keys. "Here," Margaret said softly, placing her weathered hands gently over Emma's small ones. "Feel the music, don't force it. Let me show you." Together, they pressed the keys. Margaret guided Emma's fingers through the phrase she'd been attempting, adding the grace notes, the gentle rhythm that had been missing. The music room filled with melody, rich and full, and for a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. Emma's breath caught. "It sounds different," she whispered, the first words Margaret had heard her speak. "That's because you're not alone," Margaret said. Music is always better when it's shared. From that afternoon on, they played together. Margaret would finish her morning duties, then slip into the music room where Emma waited. Already seated at the piano, her face turned expectantly toward the door. They worked through simple pieces at first, folk songs Margaret remembered from childhood, hymns her grandmother had loved. Margaret would hum along, her voice cracking on the high notes, and sometimes Emma would smile just a little. "My mother used to play this one," Emma said one afternoon, her fingers tracing the keys of a lullaby. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Did she?" "Before the accident. I don't remember what she looked like anymore, but I remember how the piano sounded when she played, like everything was going to be okay." Margaret placed her hand gently on Emma's shoulder. "Then we'll make sure it sounds that way again." They worked on it for days, that lullaby. Margaret showed Emma how to let the notes linger, how to find the spaces between the sounds where emotion lived. They laughed when they made mistakes, when Margaret's arthritic fingers stumbled over the keys, when Emma accidentally played 3 notes instead of 2. In the evenings, Margaret would return to her small apartment above the garage, her fingers aching but her heart lighter than it had been in years. She'd call her own daughter Sarah, trying to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But the conversations were still awkward, filled with things unsaid. What Margaret didn't know was that someone else was listening. James Harrison would come home each evening around 6, his tie loosened, his shoulders tight with the weight of board meetings and quarterly reports. He'd built his company from nothing, turned code into millions, but none of it had prepared him for the silence that filled his home after the accident. He'd tried everything to reach Emma: therapists, specialists, expensive schools for the blind. But his daughter had retreated into herself, and he didn't know how to follow her there. So he buried himself in work, telling himself she was better off with professionals, with people who knew what they were doing. But lately, something had changed. He'd hear music drifting through the house, real music, not the tentative fragments Emma usually produced. And sometimes he'd hear something even more precious, his daughter's laugh. One evening he came home early, drawn by a melody he almost recognized. He followed the sound to the music room, standing in the shadowed hallway where he wouldn't be seen. Through the open door he watched as the new maid, Margaret, he remembered from the paperwork, sat beside Emma at the piano. Their hands moved together across the keys. Margaret's lined and age-spotted, Emma's small and pale. But it was their faces that caught him. Emma was smiling, really smiling, her head tilted toward Margaret as if the older woman were the sun and she a flower seeking light. "That's it," Margaret was saying, her voice warm with encouragement. "Now add your own touch to it. Make it yours." Emma played a phrase, adding a small trill at the end that wasn't in the original piece. "Perfect." Margaret laughed, delighted. "You see? You're not just playing the notes, you're making music." James felt his chest constrict. When was the last time he'd seen his daughter look so alive? "Miss Margaret?" Emma said softly. "Yes, sweetheart." Do you think I'll ever be able to play like my mother did?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I think you'll play better. Because you're playing not just with your hands, but with your whole heart. That's what your mother would want." Emma leaned against Margaret's shoulder, and the older woman put her arm around the girl, holding her close. "I miss her," Emma whispered. "I know, honey. I know you do." James had to turn away, his vision blurring. He'd been so focused on fixing things, on finding solutions, that he'd forgotten to simply be there, to sit in the pain with his daughter instead of trying to solve it away. He stood in that hallway for a long time, listening as Margaret and Emma played together, their music weaving through the empty spaces of the house like light through curtains. And he realized that his daughter didn't need more therapists or specialists. She needed exactly what she'd found: someone patient enough to meet her where she was, someone willing to sit beside her in the silence until she was ready to make sound again. The next afternoon, James left work early. He stood in the doorway of the music room, his hands in his pockets, watching Margaret and Emma at the piano. Margaret noticed him first, her hands stilling on the keys. "Mr. Harrison," she said, starting to rise. "I apologize. I should have asked permission to—" "Please," James said quietly. "Don't stop." Emma's head turned toward his voice. "Daddy, I'm here, sweetheart." He crossed the room, his throat tight, and knelt beside the piano bench. "That was beautiful, what you were playing." Emma's hands twisted in her lap. "Miss Margaret's been teaching me. I can hear that." James looked up at Margaret, seeing her truly for the first time, the kindness in her eyes, the gentle strength in her weathered hands. "Thank you," he said simply. Margaret nodded, understanding all that went unspoken in those two words. "Daddy," Emma said hesitantly, "would you like to play with us?" James hadn't touched a piano in 20 years, not since college. But he saw the hope in his daughter's face, felt the possibility of connection hovering in the air like the last notes of a song. "I'd love to," he said. And so they sat together, the three of them crowded onto the piano bench, a CEO who'd forgotten how to be a father, a maid who'd learned that it's never too late to matter to someone, and a little girl who was finding her way back to the light one note at a time. Their music wasn't perfect. James stumbled over the keys, and Margaret's fingers missed more notes than they found. But Emma, sitting between them, played with a confidence she hadn't shown before, her smile growing with each passing measure. In that moment, In that room filled with the imperfect beauty of their shared song, they found something that no amount of money could buy. The simple, profound grace of being present with one another, of showing up even when you don't have all the answers, of reaching across the divides that separate us to create something beautiful together. That evening, Margaret called her daughter Sarah again. This time, instead of trying to fill the silence with small talk, she simply said, "I love you. And I'm sorry I haven't been better at showing it." There was a long pause, then Sarah's voice, soft and surprised. "Mom, are you okay?" "I am now," Margaret said. "I finally am." And in the Harrison house, as the last light of day filtered through the tall windows, 3 people sat at a piano making music together, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary thing we can do is simply show up, sit down beside someone in their darkness, and help them remember how to sing.